and welcome to Chapter 13 on Graphical User Interface. Graphical User Interface is usually shortened to GUI, GUI, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is the last chapter in the book, so I hope that you have enjoyed the book, and let's get started. So first off, what is a GUI? What is a Graphical User Interface? 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Okay, so back in the 1980s, when computers first started, they would usually be run by a command line. So it was usually just the drive number that you would use, or the drive letter, like a C drive. And then you would run commands by actually typing in the name of the command. So if I wanted to run a game, I would have to go in there and say run Ultima 5. If I wanted to open a program, I would have to say run Microsoft Word, if it existed in the 1980s. WordPerfect, one of the older ones. And so that was really complicated for a lot of people to have to actually type in the words. And we realized that pictures made things so much better, being able to have a visual cue of how to use it. So we started with windowing programs, or the idea that you would have buttons, or you would have text boxes, you would have images that were on the screen, and they were all contained within a window. This windowing version of interfaces obviously took off. We created Microsoft Windows, and all of a sudden we had this visual of how to interact with our computer. Now, yes, for those of you that are Apple fans, yes, Apple also had a windowing program, and there were ways of doing it without even using Microsoft or Apple. Different programs were created for windowing. But obviously, Microsoft Windows became a very large one and took off as a windowing program to create this graphical user interface. Graphical meaning that it was made out of graphics as opposed to being text-based, and a user interface is in a way that we've been interacting with the user. We have been using this command line interface through this entire course using our terminal. So being able to use our terminal and be able to enter things into the terminal and have it respond. That's how programs used to be done. Everything was through a terminal like that. Now we have these interfaces. So we're going to spend a chapter teaching you about how to use interfaces, graphical user interfaces with Python. So in a graphical user interface, it looks kind of like the picture on the bottom here. It's got dialog boxes, it's got windows, it's got menu options. Lots of these things can come along with your windowing or graphical user interface. The big thing about a graphical user interface, or a GUI, is that it is generally event-driven. When we say event-driven, nothing happens on the window until you do something. The act of you doing something causes the window to react and has it where it will do something every time you do something. So it has commands that it follows. It's event-driven, and we handle those events by running code in the back. So if I put the window up and I just let it sit there, it doesn't do anything. If I type in some information into the length and the width, and I push the button that says calculate area, I can have an event attached to the pushing of the button that says, go get the entries that we have in length and width and calculate it for us. So it's event driven. Everything happens from events. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand this event driven concept of nothing is going to happen until you do something, and that something has to have an event attached to it. Okay? There is no GUI program installed directly with Python. So Python uses a concept called tkinter. Tkinter, which is short for TK interface. Depending on how you pronounce it, you can call it tkinter, you can call it tkinter, you can call it tkinter. I don't care. It's all good. But this is the program that we use. This is similar to the turtle program. You have to import it, same way we do with our turtle. And then there are methods. You have to do a create, the same way we do a create turtle. You have to do a create or start the interface program. And then we have to run some methods in there. There's a main loop that we call. So when you create a windowing environment or a GUI, you use something called widgets. And each widget is in itself a component of your overall interface. We can have widgets for buttons, we can have widgets for checkboxes or radio buttons, we can have one for labels, which are just text areas that you write in. And then we can have some other ones. So we're going to talk about a couple of the different widgets that you use. The 15 of them that they explain in the book are here. By the way, try to remember that number 15 because it's one of your test questions. Actually, if you go onto tkinter's page right now, there are 18 because they've added 3 more. We're not going to talk about those other 3. We're just going to talk about the 15 that the book has, because the question in your test is going to be how many widgets are there. We're going to go with 15. So these are the 15 widgets that we want to talk about, and you can kind of look through the list and it describes it. This is also in your book, so you can reference your book to make sure that you understand what each of these different widgets do. When we want to create our window, we start with what we call a root object. The root object is the main window itself. Everything gets attached to the root, the same way if we were doing a WYSIWYG, a what you see is what you get type environment, where you picked up objects and put them onto the root. In this case, we're going to be creating objects and putting them onto our root window. A root window is pre-designed with a title across the top and a maximize, minimize, and close button. So those are already on there. Otherwise, it's a window. To do this, we have to import our tkinter. We have to define our main, so we're going to do a main function. In theory, you could do this without a main function, but I really want you to do the main function. So you're going to make a main function. And then you're going to create an object, a variable. We're going to call it main window. And we're going to set that equal to tkinter.tk. This is our constructor. This is the thing that's going to construct our windowing environment. And we're going to attach everything else to that main window. Then we're simply going to call tkinter, the module, .main loop. Main loop is a piece of code that tkinter runs that says create the window and then keep listening for events. We're just going to hang on, listen for events. We're looking for events. Is anything happening? It's all good. And it's doing this in a loop, just like any other loop. So we call it the main loop because it's the loop that's going to continually run with our windowing environment to make sure that we understand. We're going to keep looking for commands, looking for events, and make sure we respond to those. This is the most simple, basic interface that you can do. So it's only, 4 lines, and you can write your main window and then have main loop, and it's really boring. There's nothing in it, but this is what it looks like. It might be smaller when it runs on your screen, and that's fine. You can grab the edges and you can drag it open the same way you can with any window. So to make it bigger or smaller. In the previous slide, I talked about doing this in a main. What I would really rather you do is create your own GUI class. So we've done classes, and the way that we do our GUI class is we add everything to a class, and the class becomes our object itself. The nice thing about this is because it's a class, all of the variables are attached to the class. They're a self dot, and we can reference them in our methods, in our events as we're driving. So because it's an event-driven system, everything happens with events, but I need to be able to access all the different parts of my GUI, and by putting them in a class, I can do that because they all become attributes of that GUI. So what you're going to do here is you're going to build the entire interface inside of your constructor, and then you're going to have some methods that the objects are going to be calling. Widgets now become your class attributes. You still call your main loop inside of your initialization code. So remember, when we make a class, we have a class, then we have our initializer, our constructor. So in our constructor is where our code goes, our main window. In this case, I've made it just self.mainWindow because I need to be able to access it. So it's an attribute of my class. And I'm going to make that main window that TK constructor. Then I'm just going to call tkinter main loop, and it's going to run from there. To call this, instead of calling main like we did on the previous page, you're going to create a new variable called myGUI and set it equal to your class name. In this case, I have a capital M, myGUI. And by doing that, it'll run that initialization code and be able to start running your GUI. We'll do the class methods for our events, and your instance of your GUI is now your main. It's all good, okay? So one of the quick notes, if you run this piece of code, and you will get the little window pop up and it's fine, and the window's hanging up there, then you go back over to your code and you change something and you try to run your code again, but you didn't close the previous window, you'll find that nothing happens. It doesn't open a new window yet because the previous one is still running. tkinter cannot create a new window when the old one is still running. So you have to close your previous window before you can open a new one. So the little icon that I have down at the bottom here, if you have that little icon on your taskbar, that means you still have a instance of tkinter running. It's a little Python code, but it means it's still running in the background. So you have to close that. So click on that, close it out, then you can run your code. This is kind of one of those fun little errors that you'll run into and go, why is this happening? All right, let's start adding some components or some widgets to our window. The first one we're going to talk about is label. Label is great because label is your way of adding text to your screen. So you can do this as your header or your footer. You can do this before you have an entry. So the label can be used in a lot of different places on your screen. When you create a label, you're again going to reference that tkinter. So if you're looking at the code that I have here for my class, I have my initializer and I have my main window and I have my main loop. So those two things you've already seen before. All the stuff in between those is kind of new. So we are going to create a new label. To do that, we're going to create a class variable, in this case, self.label, so I can reference it later when I do my methods. Self.label. And then I'm going to do the tkinter dot, and I'm going to pick the label widget. When you hit the tkinter dot, it'll show you a list of all the widgets, and we'll go through a couple of them in this video just to show you how they work. The first attribute or the first argument that goes into that label constructor is going to be your main window. And we're going to start by just putting this in the main window. We'll talk about adding it to different windows in just a second. You can add them to a frame when we get into frames. So we're going to tell it, where do we want to put this? What collection, what object are we going to put this into? And in this case, we're just going to be putting it in the main window. And I'm going to say I am at the top. Now, I've created 4 labels here. You'll notice each of the 4 of them have a different label name. So label 1 or label 2, 3, and 4. So that I can keep them all straight. And each of them has a text field and they're all attached to the main window. When you create a widget, every single widget you create, every frame, every label, every text box, every checkbox, everything needs to be what we call packed. When you pack a widget, what that means is that you're going to tell the interpreter, compile this up and make it into an actual object and put it on the window or frame that I have selected. So it's kind of a individual, we're going to go through every widget and make sure that it's created correctly and built. So build the widget. In this case, we call it pack. The pack you can do with no arguments. You can just say pack with nothing, and it will put those widgets in order from top to bottom, just straight. So if you don't give it any arguments at this point, that'll just put them 1, 2, 3, 4 on top of each other, and it'll be fine. But you can select which side, and there are 4 sides to a window. There's the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. So I have done 4 labels here, and I have put them at the top, the bottom, the left, and the right, and added them to my main window. And as you can see, they go in those 4 different positions. Again, I can resize this window to make it bigger or smaller and make it more obvious that they're in the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. If I put 2 or 3 at the bottom, again, it will do them in order from top to bottom. So if I put 4 different things at the bottom and I didn't give them sides or put them in a frame, they will just be horizontally aligned, one's on top of the other. So as you can see, we can take this label and we can put it in different places. This is kind of a nice way of organizing. I also have a list here of other standard options and widget specific options that go with a label. So I can change the background color, I can change the font, I can change the foreground color, so the color of the text itself. I can change the width and the height. I can change whether it's underlined. Things like this. You can add any of these. I recommend in D2L, I have a link to the tkinter documentation. Go on there and play around. Make your labels look pretty, because you can. And you can make it, you can add different aspects to it to make it look the way you want it to look. So I've kind of hinted that frames were going to come up. We have the ability to break down our system or our interface into frames. Each of the different frames can be packed individually and then loaded into the main window, either left, right, top, and bottom, the same way we did an individual label. But a frame is a container that holds other widgets. So I can organize my widgets in the frame to be left, right, top or bottom within a frame, and then put the frame in my main window, and that will keep them better organized. It's kind of like putting things into little boxes. So to do a frame, you have to create a frame object, the widget, the same way that we did with the label. So tkinter.frame. And it again takes that parameter of where is it going to go. So my top frame and my bottom frame are both going to go into my main window. And when I pack them, as you can see at the bottom of the code, I'm going to pack them at the top and the bottom. So those two frames are going to be there. Then inside of my frame, I'm going to add my labels. So my labels, instead of taking the main window as their location, they're going to take the top frame or the bottom frame as their location. And that will tell it where to put those inside of the frame. When I pack those as saying that it's at the top or the bottom or the left or the right, it knows where to put those in the frame. So you can see the top and bottom of the top frame are put in top and bottom, and the left and right of the bottom frame are put side by side, left and right. So you can frame things in the way of being able to organize these. Just think of it as drawing little boxes around your widgets to be able to help organize them. You only have 4 places to put them. So you can't put them at position, 25, 75. You're going to put them at the top, the bottom, the left, the right. And inside of those frames will allow you to do that in multiple ways. Okay? Be sure that you pack all of your widgets before you pack your frames. So if the widget is not packed into the frame before you pack the frame, then it won't get there. You have to do your widgets first. So you can see that I've packed all 4 of my labels first, and then I packed my 2 frames, my top and the bottom frame. If I had packed the top and bottom frame first, the labels wouldn't have gotten in there because they would have been packed already. One of the more important parts of a GUI is your buttons. Your buttons, again, are those event-driven parts of the GUI. It's really nice to have all of this text on the screen, but I want it to actually do something. I want it to actually run some code. I want it to actually make some changes, update some things, whatever I want it to do. So in this case, I'm going to talk about both buttons and dialog boxes. So a button is a widget that is designed with a callback function or a method. So there's a method that's associated with the button. When the button is clicked, it's going to do something. This is called an event handler. We are handling the event of you pushing the button. So you pushed something, we handled it. So we have an event handler. The attribute in the button constructor is called command. What is the command we want to do when you push the button? Python knows, or tkinter knows, that the button is something that you're going to push. So it's expecting you to push it. It isn't a mouse over. In this case, it's just a command that is going to happen when you push the button, when you click it. So I'm going to create a button called my button, and I'm going to have some text that says click me, and I'm going to have a command that is going to call a method. Now this is where it comes in nice being in a class. My method is going to be myself.buttonClick. Because I'm running the button click on myself, I can access other parts of my interface because those are all attributes of my class. In this case, I don't need to because what I'm going to be using is a message box. So if you do not include a command in your button, it won't do anything. You can put a button up there, but if you don't put a command in there, it doesn't do anything when you click it. So we need to have the command. You can see I've written my command, button click, and I've taken myself, same way you always do with Python class methods. And I'm going to create what we call a message box. Now a message box is a modal object. It's a modal object. The term modal when it comes to GUIs is that it sits on top of everything else. These are those, you need to click here before you keep on going type buttons. They're called modals. And so it's going to create a modal dialog box that is going to say something, whatever text I want, with whatever title I have given it. And it's going to have the option of an OK button. That's all built into a message box. So with the message box, I'm going to call the method called showInfo. ShowInfo builds this message box, adds the text that I've requested it to do, and then just sits there until the person hits OK. So these are called dialog boxes or message boxes. They're depending on which language you're in. And you can call your dialog box from inside of your other event handlers. So this is kind of a good piece of code to be able to practice with to make sure that you can create a button on your interface and go ahead and have that attached to a method and a command and be able to handle that event. Our next type of widget is an entry. Entries are for user input. They are a long rectangular box that kind of looks inset, and it's where users are going to be typing in information. Most of the time when we had users type information, we were in a terminal, but obviously in a user interface, you need to be able to have the user write information as well. So this is where your user is going to be typing things in. It's just designed to capture input. The default entry widget is going to be about 10 characters long, but you might need to make that bigger, so you can change the width as one of the attributes of that. Okay, couple of things on this screen. First off, you can see we have our main window and our main loop at the top and the bottom. We also, and I've only included the initialize and then the method. I haven't included all of the code, but obviously this is inside of a class, and we called our class, but we've done that a few times and I didn't feel like it was necessary to keep that code in here. All right, we have created a top frame and a bottom frame. My top frame is going to have the please enter the distance in kilometers and an entry box. The bottom frame is going to have the value, this is 6.21 miles, and a button called convert. So two different sections of my code. So if I picked up this window and made it bigger, you would see that it would be all on the top and all on the bottom, because that's how I've created it. The label that I have in front of my entry box is necessary. So when you have an entry box, you need to tell your user what's going to go in that entry box. So generally you have a label and then an entry box right next to it. And you can see that I have those both in the top frame, and I have them as left and right so that they're kind of bumped together, left and right next to each other, so that the user can enter those in and see it nicely. If you didn't put them at left and right, it would be the label on the top, and then underneath that would be the text box, which is fine if that's how you want your interface. The entry just takes where does the entry go, but you can see that I have a object called self.input, and this is where the entry is going to go. I'm going to need that input later when I go and get the value out of it. So for right now, telling it that it's an entry object, a widget, and then I'm putting it in the variable named self.input. Now in my bottom frame, this gets a little bit more difficult. I am going to use a label field to fill in my resulting value, but I don't know what it is yet, so I'm not going to just type it in there. So what I'm going to use is what's called a string variable. By creating a string variable in my code, I can change the value of this variable, and it will change what the label value is in text. It's going to set that label value equal to whatever that variable is. So in this case, I have created a variable called value, and that value is a string variable, string var. This is related to tkinter, and it needs to be there to be able to use variables. You can't just use regular variables. You have to use a tkinter string variable so that it can access it and use it. So it's very important. You couldn't just say, you know, quote 123 here. You have to make it a string variable. You could have added some default values in there. I didn't want to. I wanted it to be blank to begin with. So I just made a blank string var. Then when I create my label, I'm going to use the text variable attribute. So you can see it's highlighted here in yellow. The tkinter label is going to go in the bottom frame, and it's going to have a text variable label, or a text variable of that self value. So you can see I've attached that value. So when I change the value down in my method, it will be attached there and it'll print it out there. Next, I have my button, and the button uses the command of calculate. So it's going to go find the calculate method. I've packed everything and went ahead and ran my main loop. So that's all in my initializer. In my calculate method, again, I'm going to take self because I need to be able to access those self variables. I am going to cast my value from my input into a float. Now, I can't just call self.input because that's the widget itself. I need to get the value out of it. So we use a method called get. In some cases, in some languages, it would be like text or whatever the attribute was that was attached to that. In tkinter, it's just get. We can use get, and it'll get the value from an input. So we're going to use self.input.get. Make sure you use the open and close parentheses. And then we're going to cast that into a float because I need to do some math on it. Remember, that's a string, the same way it is when you do it in a terminal. So we're going to go ahead and cast that to a float, and we're going to give us our kilometers variable. Now I can use this kilometers variable inside of my code. I'm going to turn into a mile. So I'm going to take miles. I'm going to make that equal to kilometers times 0.16114. And then I'm going to set that string variable, my var or self var value, that string variable self value. I'm going to set the value of that equal to the string. This is blank miles, and I'm going to fill it in. So this is going to allow us to take that value that comes from that string var and fill that in. The label that we created, the widget, is going to absorb that automatically. So as soon as we set it, it's going to fill that in. If I came back in and I changed this from 1,000 to 2,000 and hit calculate, it would replace that with the new value. Okay, so this is how you can get user entry, having the user enter some stuff, and then be able to use your labels to print the output. Now is a good time for you to take a break and go play with some of this. So the code in the book is on 618 to 622. And this is 13.19. And it's going to be a window that allows you to take 3 test scores and calculate the average. So just a simple math problem. But you're going to be doing labels for each of your entries. You're going to be doing the entry fields. So you're going to have 3 entries, 3 labels. Then you're going to have the label in front of your average and a label for the average value. Instead of making that all 1, they made it into 2. It's your code, write it any way you want. Then it has 2 buttons. The first is the calculate the average button, and the second one is the quit button. We haven't really talked about that, but it'll walk you through how to actually quit and close down your window. You're going to have event handlers attached to both of your buttons, and you're going to update, so you're going to need that string var to be able to fill in that label. So go have fun with this section and come back when you're done. So hopefully you got all of your windowing to work and it looked beautiful, and I did the calculation and I did the event handler, and you feel really good about it right now. We're going to add a couple more widgets. So these widgets are radio buttons and checkboxes. Most GUIs will give you the option of radio buttons and checkboxes, and they have different attributes. So a radio button is generally in a group where all 3 or 4 of the buttons are pick one only. You can only select one. Radio buttons are usually circles, and you can only have one of them selected. There are 3 attributes that go along with them. The variable attribute, you're going to use that int var, kind of like a string var, but it's an integer, to figure out what value you're going to use to pick one of these 3. You're going to have the value of each, so I could have option 1 is equal to 1, option 2 is equal to 2, and option 3 is equal to 3. And then a text attribute that is going to be the label. It already creates a label with it because radio buttons need labels. They know that, so they already added it as part of the thing. When we change that int var from 1, 2, or 3, we'll determine which of the 3 radio buttons is activated, which one has the little black dot in the middle of it. So using your the radio buttons, it knows that clicking the radio button sets it to that value, and it knows that the other ones need to be turned off. Radio buttons are very, very smart. They figure this part out for you. Some of them you have to write code. You can have a callback or an event handler for a radio button. You don't need one to get it to change the value, but you can if you want to do something with that value. Like when you select this, I want to go update the total, or I want to go update something else. So you can have a callback event handler if you want with your buttons. Checkboxes are squares, not circles. Circles and squares. So circles are radios. There's one option. Checkboxes, you can have multiple options. You can select all 3 if you want. They also have an int variable that is associated with them, but you need to create an individual int var for each checkbox. With radio buttons, you create one and you use it throughout. With a checkbox, you use 3 different ones because you need to know which one is turned on and which one is not. So you can go through and check your checkbox int vars to figure out which ones are turned on and off to be able to make some changes. Again, they come with a text, a label attached to them, because again, having a checkbox in the middle of the room doesn't help anybody if you don't know what it does. And you can also add an event handler to these as well. So those are a few of the basic widgets that we use to just build our GUI. There is another aspect of the tkinter system that you can do, which is a canvas. And the canvas allows you to draw. So you can draw pictures, you can draw shapes, you can add text randomly just to make it pretty. Canvases, as opposed to being top, bottom, left, and right, is a widget itself, and yet it has a coordinate system, rectangular coordinate system, that has a 0, 0 in the top left corner, and the bottom right corner is going to be whatever your resolution is. So it might change depending on how big you make your screen. With a canvas, you can run some methods like create line, create rectangle, create oval, create arc, create polygon. So making shapes, and they'll take the starting corner, the top left corner, and the bottom right corner. So the X and Y coordinates at the top and the X and Y coordinates at the bottom. For a line, it's the top and bottom. So you can make a line that goes straight, or you can make it at a diagonal. So you can top the start and end. Rectangle kind of makes sense because the rectangle, you can just take 2 points to create it. An oval puts a square or a rectangle around your circle and puts the X and Y coordinates of that rectangle. You can't see the rectangle, but that's how you define it. So if you want to make your rectangle or your oval more wide or more tall, you can change your X and Y coordinates there. An arc asks for a starting angle and an extent. So how long do you want to make it, and what do you want the angle to be? So these are aspects that you can put into the arc. And an arc also gives you the option of a style. Do you want it to be a pie slice, an arc, or a chord? And each of them look a little bit different. We can create a polygon, which is just a series of X and Y coordinates connected together. Your polygon will always finish itself because we're telling it it's a shape. So if you wanted to make something that was the same, that was like an 8-sided shape, you could create that by picking all of the XY coordinates that you needed for that shape. And the create text allows you to actually enter text into your picture. So you can pick an XY coordinate and then put in some text, and it'll put the text in that location. Each of these different aspects has some optional attributes. So you have the required, like the X and Y's, those are required, but you can also add in things like, I want it to be dashed. I want it to be filled in. I want the width to be this big for the lines. I want the outline to be this color. And then where do I want the text to start? Do I want it in the middle? Do I want it in the top or the bottom? So these are some options. Again, go check out the tkinter interface or instructions, the documentation online, and see if that will help you to understand how to do this. All right, so there is a quiz for chapter 13. Be sure you reference that page 600, the table 13.1, for the different widgets, because it's going to ask you which widget does this and which widget does that. So shouldn't be too difficult of a quiz for chapter 13, but it's on D2L. And then I have 3 programming assignments, but I don't want you to really do the ones out of the book. I want you to kind of make it your own. So the first one is a language translator that's converting from Latin to English. If you really want to, you can use the Latin, but I'd much rather have you pick something different. So pick a language that you want to translate into and pick at least 3 words. You can have 5 or 6, where you see the word in one language, you click the button, and it changes the word to the other language. You can pick something fun like Elven or Klingon, or you can just pick French or Spanish or, German, Russian, something a little bit more exciting than the 3 that were in the book. So that's your language translator. That's number 2. Number 6 is a service option. So they give you, for Joe's Automotive, you can do these different things. I'd really rather have you pick a different sales industry as long as you have services. So this can be a nail salon, this can be hair, this can be something else. You want to build a new computer. These are aspects that you want to add to it. This is a resort that you want to go to, and you want to have golf, and you want to have swimming or whatever, you want to go do the zip line, something kind of fun. So service options, so things that would provide a service for someone. You could do it as a restaurant, something kind of a little different than the Joe's Automotive. I want to see some of your creativity here. So you can pick any sales industry that you want as long as you have at least 5 services, but use kind of the template of what they've given you on number 6. And then number 8 says draw a house. Well, that's a little too easy. So I want you to draw any type of image. I want you to add some attributes to it, add some color, add some shapes. Pick an image to draw. You need to have at least 6 individual shapes. So rectangle, square, circle, arc, something like that. So you need to have at least 6 different parts to it, but go ahead and make a pretty picture and show me how creative you can get with tkinter. So these are your homework assignments, and hopefully you're having fun with this. The final exam or the final project should be up pretty quickly, and we'll talk about that at the team meeting. But otherwise, have a fabulous week. I hope that you have enjoyed these and learned a lot. Talk to you soon.